From the first day, Deborah held her baby Nancy in her arms. She knew her little girl was different, not like the other babies. At first it was a feeling, then a suspicion, and over the years, as her little girl grew up into a young woman, it was a fact. One she kept to herself. Her daughter wasn't going to live to see her 21st birthday. So when she heard her daughter was found dead at the age of 20, she wasn't surprised. But as she learned the details around her daughter's death, she was shocked to discover her daughter was murdered. Even more surprising, her killer was somehow a victim. And more shocking than that, her daughter was the suspect, the villain, the accused in her own death. Tonight's episode is about a woman who found herself in impossible circumstances. A woman who not only had to fight for justice in the murder of her daughter, she also had to fight the world to clear her child's name and confront her own dark feelings as a mother and face a complicated truth. How she raised a daughter who was so difficult to love. No, Deborah's daughter was no angel. But she didn't deserve to die. This is Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller. I am the host, writer, producer, and creator of this show. And if you are someone who likes to listen to true crime before bed and is looking for the podcast that gets that and sees you, you don't need to explain it to me. You've come to the right place. Tonight's episode is drawn from a true crime memoir, the first of its kind, published in 1983 called And I Don't Want to Live This Life. You'll hear all about it in this episode. I read it a bunch of times when I was young, maybe too young, because this story's pretty raw. I decided to transform it into a dead sleep bedtime story after I came across an interview with the comedian Tig Notaro. Tig Notaro has this book as the #1 favorite book of hers of all time. And for good reason. It's one part brutally honest memoir and another part murder mystery. Only the mystery here is one mother trying to uncover the mystery of her own child so she could get people to understand everything that her daughter had been through. And then maybe she could get justice and her daughter could find peace. As always, there are no graphic depictions of violence in Dead Sleep. And I believe I've handled this material accurately and tastefully. But this memoir, and therefore this episode, does cover a murder and drug use and mental health stuff and suicide. That again, I think I've handled it in a way that you can feel okay about. But of course, that's subjective. It's your subconscious, your sleep. So please take care while listening. If you've been listening to Dead Sleep, gosh, it's coming on a year now. You know that this is a passion project for me, that Dead Sleep is 100% self-funded, independent, and ad-free. And it will stay that way forever. Ads may work in other true crime podcasts, but it doesn't work here. I don't want them, you don't want them, and we don't need them. Trust me, I have no illusions about the economic challenges of podcasting. But your subscription shows me that this show fills a need. And I'll continue doing it as long as there's a need and people willing to subscribe to fulfill that need. And if there aren't any subscribers, that either means there isn't a need, which is good, or someone's doing it better, which is also fine. I love making this show, and I'll continue to do it as long as I can. So your reciprocity and generosity, it means everything. I've been wanting to do this show for years, and I finally found the time, and thanks to you, the opportunity. You can subscribe to Dead Sleep through Patreon, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And if those three options aren't available to you as a subscriber, let me know. You can reach me at deadsleeppodcast@gmail.com. Now let's get to the story. Settle in for the night. Close your eyes and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. And a saga I'm calling She Never Lit Up a Room. Because we know what that means, don't we? It's such a cliche. She always lit up a room. It's been said so much on shows like Dateline and other true crime series. It's a worldwide meme. And the intention behind this is completely understandable. Too often, murder victims are defined by their deaths, not their lives. And something that true crime coverage has done these past couple of decades on shows like Dateline and our crime dad, Keith Morrison, is that they've succeeded in putting the victim and her family front and center. Giving a family member, a mother, the chance to go on camera and talk about her child. It was an opportunity, a rare opportunity, for a mother to be able to describe her daughter as she remembered her and celebrate her life and not have her be defined solely by the circumstances of her death. So a mother could explain who her daughter really was. She was a wonderful person, generous, kind. She had a million friends. Everyone loved her. She had a sparkle in her eye. And yes, wherever she went, she always lit up the room. And when we hear that, it's understood. Here was a good girl, a girl who had her whole life ahead of her. One that was tragically and violently cut short. And therefore she deserves our respect, our compassion, and justice. Deborah, she didn't have a child like that. Deborah's daughter, Nancy, she never lit up a room. Well, unless it was to set it on fire. Nancy darkened every door. she wasn't the life of the party. She spoiled every party. She actually usually was the end of the party. She terrorized her younger siblings. She scared her own parents. That's Deborah and Nancy's father, Frank. And Deborah couldn't honestly say her daughter had a whole long life ahead of her, because she knew that her daughter was never going to see her 21st birthday. Growing up, Nancy didn't have many friends. Any friendships she started would soon end, with the girls either ganging up on her or Nancy scaring them away. It was sad, really. In junior high school, Nancy demanded that she get a princess phone in her own line. She got the phone, she got the line. The phone never rang. Nancy was growing up in the tumultuous 1960s and 70s. Vietnam War, the hippie culture, and the emergence of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And Nancy, she was drawn to this world. In her teens, she finally made some friends. Friendships based on a shared love of music and something else. A bond that glued them together. Nancy had a passion for a one and only true love. Heroin. Deborah wasn't just fearful her daughter was going to die young. She knew it was going to happen. Nancy even said as much, that she was going to die young. Deborah learned to live in the anticipation of that dreaded phone call. The kind of call that came at 3 a.m. A call informing her that we're very sorry, but your daughter Nancy was found. Finish sentence here. In this grim game of Mad Libs, the second half of that sentence would be a variation on, we found her somewhere in an abandoned house. We found her in a dark alley. We found her in someone's bedroom. But the detail that was always the same, no matter the scenario, we always found her with a needle in her arm. In the 70s, this was an archetype. A teen girl dead from an OD, go ask Alice style. Deborah had a vivid picture in her mind of bravely going to the coroner to ID her daughter's heroin-ravaged body. Because under the pale white skin, covered with a lattice of track marks, and the raccoon heavy black eye makeup, and the blood-red lipstick and teased bleach blonde hair, under all that was her little girl. No matter what she looked like, no matter how she died, she would always be her baby, her first daughter, whose name is derived from the word grace. That's how Deborah imagined her daughter's death. One that was tragic, but ultimately would bring Nancy peace. And if that sounds macabre, to imagine your own child dying, Deborah might argue that it's the reality for parents who've struggled with a child's addiction for years. Good parents who tried everything, every rehab and intervention, unleashing every emotional weapon in a parent's arsenal, from begging to shaming to tough love. And nothing changed. She'd stop for a while and then go back to using again. And in 1976, when Nancy turned 18 and became an adult, they had to accept it. A grim acquiescence that in order to live your life and be a proper parent to your other kids, to be able to hold down a job to keep your marriage together, to stay sane. You had to surrender that this was the way things were. This was your daughter's choice. At least for now, until further notice. So that was where things were with Deborah and her daughter Nancy. In the fall of 1978. She was just glad Nancy was in touch these days and speaking to her. After years of sporadic contact, the phone only ringing to get in touch for money that Nancy would swear was for all kinds of things. Everything, of course, except for what it really was for buying heroin. The heroin that would eventually lead to Nancy's death, and to that imminent 3 a.m. phone call. Deborah had played that scenario out in her mind for so long it almost became a comfort. She would think about her daughter's death in traffic, maybe while doing dishes, doing ordinary tasks, mentally preparing herself, almost girding herself that if she were ready for when that day came, it wouldn't hurt as much. If only life and death worked like that. It was October 12th, 1978. What Deborah remembers as a glorious fall day as Deborah drove from her home in suburban Pennsylvania to her job in New Jersey. And even though Deborah's children were too old for trick-or-treating now, there were fond memories of how back then, being scared, it was just for one night only. And that fear, it was imaginary, it was fun. It was just for pretend. Like that movie that had just come out. It was called Halloween. And in that movie, there was a killer out there attacking high school students. His name is Michael Myers. In that movie, Michael Myers has escaped from a mental institution. He never speaks. He only stalks, surprising his victims, ending their lives, always silent, while they scream, ending young lives with the slide of a single blade. But that was the movies. That was the stuff that happened in the dark, on screen. Nobody died like that in real life. Did they? Deborah was at her office, at her desk, when the receptionist buzzed and told her she had a phone call from a Lieutenant Hunter from the Lower Moreland Police. Deborah wondered what the local police wanted with her. As she reached for the phone, she glanced down at her desk calendar. The date was October 12th, 1978. On that calendar, she'd made a note to herself, an important task to her never-ending to-do list. The note was about a rehab center, one that Nancy hadn't been to before, a new place that, much to Deborah's surprise, was a place that Nancy herself said she wanted to check into. Then she picked up the phone and said brightly, reflexively, "Hello, this is Deborah Spungen. Can I help you, Lieutenant Hunter?" The man on the other end, the lieutenant, sounded uncomfortable. "The New York Police Department would like to speak to you. Something has happened to your daughter, Nancy." Deborah asked what happened. He didn't answer, and instead he gave Deborah the number of a detective, a number to call in New York City. Then he was silent. Deborah could feel her face, suddenly getting hot. "Lieutenant, please tell me what happened. It's okay. I'm ready for anything, believe me. But I will not hang up this phone until you tell me what has happened to my daughter." "Mrs. Spungen," he said, "I am sorry to tell you that your daughter is dead." Deborah was in disbelief. After thinking about her daughter's death so many times, Deborah thought for certain that if her daughter died, she would have sensed it, gotten some type of feeling, a chill, a tingle, something. She didn't. This thing, this nightmare, this fantasy that Deborah had been thinking about over and over again about her daughter's death, it finally come true. The lieutenant gave her a number for a detective at the NYPD, and he told her to call. And that's all he said. He didn't tell her how her daughter died, but as far as Deborah was concerned, he didn't need to. She knew. She'd known for years. She'd played it out over and over and over in her mind. Her daughter was dead from an overdose. She would get the details from this detective in New York. It had finally happened. She expected to feel relief. Nancy was dead. And then she did something strange. She flung open the door to her office and basically shouted to her boss, and everyone else in the office could hear. She blurted out, "Nancy's dead," like she was excited about the news. She wasn't as in control of her emotions as she thought. She called the detective, her fingers shaking as she dialed the phone number. She was patched through to a Detective Brown at the NYPD. "I'm sorry to tell you this," the detective said, a kind tone in his voice. "Your daughter has been murdered, Mrs. Spungen." Murdered? Her baby murdered? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. First of all, it was supposed to be a 3 a.m. phone call, and she was supposed to be with her husband, together, so they could take in the news. Instead, it was daytime. She was in an office, alone, and her husband was on a business trip. And that's when she discovered that her daughter Nancy, she wasn't found in some crummy apartment with a needle in her arm. She was found in the bathroom of a Manhattan hotel. The knife plunged into her abdomen. Murder, overdose. What was the difference? Nancy was dead. But there was a difference. But dying from a heroin overdose, it could have been accidental, or at least it was an act of free will. It's impersonal and not painful. Nancy could have just drifted off, her heart stopping at the end of a dream. But murder, stabbing someone, that was very personal, up close, at once brutal and intimate. Nancy was no angel, but murder? Who would want to kill her daughter? New York City in the late 70s was like Gotham with no Batman, a place teeming with disaster, no one coming to the rescue. Trash was piled sky high. People scurried through the streets like rats in a maze. Rolling blackouts meant the darkness came in unpredictable waves. A darkness so heavy you could barely breathe. Deranged criminals lurked in the shadows. Serial killers with names like Son of Sam, the Torso Killer, the Times Square Ripper. There would be no end to who might want to target a girl like Nancy. Detective Brown did have one piece of good news for Deborah. Nancy's alleged killer was already in custody. His name was John Simon Ritchie. At least that's what his mother called him. To everyone else all over the world, he was known by another name, by his stage name, his punk rock nom de guerre, Sid Vicious. As a 40-year-old woman living in the suburbs, Deborah had no idea who Sid Vicious was or who the Sex Pistols were until her daughter struck up a romance with Sid Vicious when Nancy moved to London in 1977. Nancy was obsessed with music. She had an ear for it. Deborah noticed Nancy always knew which band was going to be big before anybody else. Nancy's taste and instincts appeared to be her calling, and maybe even the beginning of a career. Nancy went to every show, went backstage with every band, Aerosmith, Queen, Bad Company. At least that's what she said. And in reality, she was mostly a groupie. Until she moved to London and met Sid Vicious, her first night in town. Nancy and Sid, it was love at first snarl. Sid and Nancy met in 1977, not long after Sid Vicious had joined the Sex Pistols as their bass player. The Sex Pistols were already pretty big when Sid joined the band. He was good friends with the frontman, Johnny Rotten. And their sound, their punk rock anthem, Anarchy in the UK, tapped into a type of rage and humor and disgust with the status quo that resonated with young people in London, then in England, all over the UK, then New York, then the United States, and soon all over the world. What you're hearing now is the Dead Sleep acoustic version of that song. A simple 4-chord structure. And that was by design. Because the Sex Pistols were a band, but they weren't musicians. And the guys in the band, Sid Vicious, Johnny Rotten, and the rest, they didn't even really know how to play their instruments. They were a product. And for all of their supposed punk rock ethos, the Sex Pistols were as engineered as the Spice Girls. Created by producer and Svengali and marketing mastermind Malcolm McLaren. And I'm going to take a moment to talk about Malcolm McLaren here because, for one, not enough people know who he is. And two, in Deborah's book, she describes the influence that Malcolm McLaren had on Sid Vicious as one of the key connections between Sid, Nancy, and her death. Malcolm McLaren wasn't a musical genius. He was a ruthless appropriator. He was able to see a trend on the horizon and capitalize on that trend quickly and profitably. He started his career with designer Vivienne Westwood in a shop they had in London called Sex. Malcolm McLaren was a striking figure, eccentric, a dandy with bright red hair and extreme features. I'd definitely cast Cillian Murphy in the biopic. After his success with the Sex Pistols, he would go on to help launch the careers of Adam Ant, Bow Wow Wow. He's one of the founding fathers of the British New Wave and a shameless colonizer of American music. In the mid-'80s, he heavily borrowed from hip-hop and ballroom culture, voguing before Madonna brought it mainstream. The Sex Pistols were his biggest and most signature foray, launching the punk scene worldwide. Malcolm McLaren was a headstrong and controlling manager, and he had a knack for choosing young people for his bands that didn't really have a mind of their own. And he filled Sid Vicious with ideas about his own importance and his own talent when neither one of those things was really true. Except it felt true to Sid Vicious and true to Nancy Spungen, who was the Yoko to his John Lennon. Only where John and Yoko promoted giving peace a chance, Nancy and Sid wanted to burn the whole world down. Sid and Nancy were inseparable, and, to many, especially Malcolm McLaren, insufferable. And it was Nancy's meddling in Sid's life and career that's believed to have been one reason why the Sex Pistols broke up in 1978. And apparently Nancy was also to blame for turning Sid Vicious onto drugs, into heroin. Whatever the case, by 1978, when they moved back to the States, back to New York, they were both heavily addicted and were on methadone to try and kick that addiction. And that's when Nancy got back in touch with Deborah, eager for her to meet her boyfriend, Sid, the love of her life, and come over for dinner at Deborah and Frank's house in suburban Pennsylvania. This was the fall of 1978, about a month before Nancy's death. Deborah had no idea what to expect. When Nancy showed up, she was all smiles and all skin and bones. Nancy's legs were spindly and her face gaunt. Her look was more than edgy. It was scary. And it seemed that's exactly the way that Nancy wanted it. Sid was even more terrifying. He was rail thin, ghastly white, with black spiky hair. Sid was tall and towered over Deborah. He came to dinner wearing a leather jacket, leather pants, and no shirt. That night at the family dinner, with Nancy, Sid, Deborah, Frank, and their two younger children who were teenagers at this time, Nancy and Sid mostly huddled together and chain-smoked. Yet there was something about him that was childlike, puppyish. Nancy seemed to guide his every move, telling him how many cookies he could eat, cutting his steak for him at the dinner table. Not long after that dinner, however, Deborah would discover Sid had another side. One night, when the phone rang, it was Nancy. She and Sid were at the Chelsea Hotel. Nancy was asking Deborah if she could have some money. There was something wrong with her kidneys and she needed to go to the ER and get it checked out. Could she have $3,000, please? Deborah had been through this a million times before. She told Nancy that she knew that they had an understanding, that she didn't give Nancy money, and if she went to the doctor, she could just have the doctor send the bill and Deborah would pay it. Then Sid grabbed the phone, and his voice wasn't meek and quiet and bashful like it was at that dinner. He was furious. He was demanding for Deborah to give Nancy the effing money, and that she was a terrible mother and what was wrong with her, and she really better give Nancy that money. Deborah, of course, wouldn't relent. But Sid's tone, it scared her. And she wondered how many times he'd taken that tone with Nancy. After that incident, Nancy called and said that she had a confession to make. That there were times when Nancy had bumps and bruises, and she told Deborah that she and Sid had gotten beaten up. There was something about their punk look that provoked people and triggered violence. But those times that she said that she'd had a broken nose or a gashed ear, it actually wasn't a gang of strangers that beat her up. It was Sid. Just about the last thing that Deborah wanted was for Nancy to come back home. Nancy brought chaos wherever she went. But it was her child. So she told Nancy, leave Sid and come stay here. Nancy had another idea. And that's when she asked about this rehab place. It was a place in Pennsylvania. And would Deborah look into it? Nancy was tired. And if Sid was willing to go, they could go to this rehab together, get clean, and then they'd really start their lives. Deborah said that she would call, and later she marked it on a date in her calendar, October 12th, 1978. Deborah allowed herself to feel a dangerous emotion, a tiny little flicker that, as Nancy's mother, she couldn't ever extinguish. That flicker was hope. Now, of course, that hope was gone. After Deborah hung up with that detective, she needed to reach her husband, Frank, to tell him the news. She couldn't have him find out about this from the headlines. Deborah would need to act fast, because Nancy's death was already making the headlines. Deborah always imagined her daughter's death would be mourned by a handful of people who knew her well. But her killer, Sid Vicious, was famous, infamous. And Sid and Nancy together, their faces were plastered all over the newspapers and on TV. And together, they looked like this freakish Bonnie and Clyde. It wasn't a girl that Deborah recognized. But that's what everyone saw. And that's what everyone believed. Deborah tried to stick to the original plan. The routine she'd played out in her head a million times. How she'd call the mortuary, plan the funeral. It would be intimate, quiet, a farewell to her little girl, who was finally at peace. But none of this was as she'd planned. Her daughter wasn't at peace. She'd been stabbed and left to die. And her killer was her boyfriend, Sid Vicious, one of the most notorious punk rock stars in the world. Nancy Spungen's death wouldn't go quietly or respectfully. It would be one of the biggest things that happened in 1978. A death that would be the fodder for tabloids, movies, and even now, the source of intrigue and speculation. And the madness started before Deborah and Frank met with detectives, before they'd even identified Nancy's body. There were reporters everywhere outside of the Spungen home in suburban Pennsylvania. On the phone, calling every 3 minutes. Outside of the Manhattan hotel, the Chelsea Hotel. And splashing the front page of a tabloid paper that the police were reading when Deborah and Frank approached the desk. It was the day after Nancy had been found murdered in that hotel room. They were there to meet with the detectives and identify the body. No one would ever have suspected that Nancy would be the child of people who look like Deborah and Frank. Just average-looking suburban parents. Which is why the cop maybe felt free to refer to Nancy as a slut, not realizing that Nancy's parents were standing right there. Things got worse when they went to ID Nancy with the medical examiner. Nancy was referred to exclusively as the body. What's your relationship to the body? How old was the body? Frank went in first, and when he came out, he told Deborah not to go in there, don't look. Deborah didn't go in. A decision that she'd later regret. But at the moment, she had more pressing matters. She and her husband had met with detectives, and they learned that Sid Vicious had been charged with the murder of Nancy Spungen. There would likely be a trial. Was Sid innocent, guilty of murder? That was for the court to decide. When Sid was arrested, at the very least, he was guilty of believing his own BS. When they tried to put handcuffs on him, he said, "You can't arrest me. I'm a rock star." Would his status have any influence on his murder case? That wasn't clear. Nancy's life was influencing the coverage around her, and it was despicable. At home, they started receiving phone calls that said horrible things about their child. In the press, she was known as nauseating Nancy. There were cruel jokes about her on late-night TV. Nancy wasn't perfect, but she didn't deserve this heap of scorn that was thrown at her. Deborah wanted to get Nancy's story out there. The problem was, Nancy's story was complicated. She didn't light up a room. But that didn't mean that people could say that she deserved to die. Maybe if she could tell the story of her daughter's life, she could help solve the mystery of her death. And to do that, she'd tell the truth, starting from the very beginning, the first day of Nancy's life. This should have been the best day in Deborah's life. Her baby girl was born, but it wasn't. For starters, Deborah slept through the entire birth. This was the late 1950s. Doctors gave her an injection in her spine and knocked her out. And the next thing she knew, she woke up to someone pounding on her chest, letting her know that she'd had a baby girl. Deborah remembered becoming conscious and unconscious, and each time she'd wake up, she'd ask to see her baby. And then someone would put her to sleep again. Finally, she woke up and was determined to stay awake and demanded, "Can I please see my baby?" And that's when she found out that there was something wrong with Nancy. That she was born cyanotic, which meant she was born blue. Cyan, C-Y-A-N. Her cord was wrapped around her neck, depriving her of oxygen. The doctor told her not to be concerned. They gave her a heart stimulant, and she seemed to be improving. Whether her brain being deprived of that oxygen had a difference in the trajectory of Nancy's life, they couldn't say for sure. But it was at least symbolic of a girl who would grow into a young woman who always seemed to be fighting, struggling to survive. And Deborah distinctly remembered when she was really little, trying to pick her little baby up to comfort her. And instead, she could feel her daughter's body stiffen, not wanting to be touched. She learned how to talk. And some of the first things that she said to her mother were threats. Terrible things that she was going to do when she was angry, when her mother said no. In a halting stutter, one time when she was little, she told her mother that she was going to cut up all of her clothes. And she was able to name every single item in Deborah's closet. Nancy was obviously extremely intelligent and very troubled. And Nancy wasn't a sociopath. That was the weird thing and the hard thing, actually, because Nancy felt pain. She sensed that she was doing things wrong. She sensed that she didn't fit in. She sensed that she couldn't ever seem to get enough of things. Not enough love, not enough attention. The doctors put it back on Deborah. It was something that she was doing. She had to try harder to be a better mother. There was nothing, it seemed, that Deborah could do right. And for years, she blamed herself. Nancy was 11 when she first talked about wanting to end her own life. It seemed the confusion and the frustration that she felt constantly, and the impulse to want to fight and destroy, she couldn't take it anymore. Deborah wrote in her book that she wasn't quite sure, in the end, what was wrong with her, what had happened to her daughter. But she did know that her daughter was extremely self-destructive. And getting into drugs, particularly heroin, was the perfect way to self-medicate. Heroin smoothed out all of those dark edges. And it also gave her that frightening withdrawal, that sense of doom, a place where Nancy was used to living, right on that sharp knife's edge. It was all just so complicated. Deborah's biggest fear was if this case against Sid Vicious went to trial, that she'd be called to testify, and her daughter's past would be used against her, and her killer, Sid Vicious, would go free. Deborah despised Sid as a monster. But out there in the world, especially with fans of the Sex Pistols, it was Sid who should be pitied. She deserved to die, and he deserved mercy. Meanwhile, Deborah learned Sid was desperate to speak to her, but she didn't want to speak to him. Soon after she learned Sid was released on cash bail, she received a letter. And that letter surprised her. Because, first, it was well written. Guess Sid was smarter than he looked. And second, this letter seemed sincere. He told Deborah that he'd loved Nancy more than anything in the world, that they'd loved each other. He didn't want to live without her, and that he was planning his own death so they could be together. He wrote to Deborah suggesting that he and Nancy had a pact, and that he'd failed, and now he wanted to die. Maybe this was a manipulation, working an angle before his trial. But she knew Nancy. Nancy was a powerful force who was desperate to be loved. She put the letter that he sent her back into the envelope, and as she did so, she discovered a folded piece of paper. It was a poem that he'd written. As she read it, she wondered, maybe this was real. Here's the poem. Just imagine it's in the voice of Gary Oldman. Nancy, you were my little baby girl, and I shared all your fears. Such a joy to hold you in my arms and kiss away your tears. But now you're gone, there's only pain and nothing I can do. And I don't want to live this life if I can't live for you. To my beautiful baby girl, our love will never die. Deborah's throat tightened. She was so confused. Here, in a few verses, were the last 20 years of Deborah's life. Deborah felt like she could have written that poem. The feelings, the pain, they were all hers. But she hadn't written it. Sid Vicious had written it. The man she thought of as a monster. A man who had described himself to the police as a dirty dog. She wanted to hate him, but somehow she couldn't. Sid was out on bail and couldn't leave the state, but then the newspapers, with an announcement, Malcolm McLaren, manager of the Sex Pistols, announced Sid Vicious was staging a comeback, finishing up a film about the Sex Pistols, recording a new album, and going on tour. His first gigs were at a venue in Philadelphia, just 15 days after Nancy's death. McLaren told Sid that Nancy would have wanted it that way. And thanks to Malcolm McLaren, Sid was just an obedient little machine. At least that's what Deborah thought. But those gigs never happened. Roughly 10 days after Nancy was found dead, Sid tried to take his own life, cutting himself with shards of a broken light bulb. Then, another time, trying to jump out of a window. Sid ended up in Bellevue. While there, he'd written Deborah again. And that's when she learned that maybe What had happened between Nancy and Sid was more complicated than murder. Sid claimed that Nancy had once asked if he would be willing to pour petrol over himself and set himself on fire if she told him to. And he'd said, yes. Deborah couldn't know the truth, but she was the foremost expert in her daughter's life. And now that she had Sid's letters, along with the police confirming that Nancy had indeed bought that knife, Deborah now believed Nancy had engineered her own death. When she closed her eyes, she could almost hear her daughter's voice saying, "If you really loved me, you'd help me die." And she could hear Sid's protestations. And then her daughter's screams, her demands, until he relented. In Deborah's mind, she'd solved the mystery, but this wasn't suicide. There was no legal definition for what this was. With Sid's trial looming, if Deborah was called to testify, how would she describe what she believed happened? This isn't in Deborah's book, but in psychology circles, there's something called folie à deux. That's French for the madness of two, a shared psychosis between two people. This history of shared psychosis between two people, it's way too much to explain here, and it's definitely worthy of a whole episode. But in the case of Sid and Nancy, there's a subset of this shared psychosis known as folie imposée. Folie imposée. That translates as imposed madness, where one of the two people is more dominant, and their dominance imposes or induces a delusional belief on the other. That second person is usually more passive, easier to manipulate. And it's fair to say, by Deborah's estimation, that was Sid. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a weak-minded, messed up kid. Sid's lawyer, however, was a notorious and controversial legal mastermind. Somehow, probably through Malcolm McLaren, Sid could afford to retain the services of F. Lee Bailey, known for defending some of the most high-profile defendants in American criminal history, from the Boston Strangler case to O.J. Simpson. Deborah knew that if this went to trial, F. Lee Bailey would destroy whatever filaments of dignity or humanity her daughter Nancy had left. She'd seen it before in other criminal cases, where the victim was put on trial and not there to defend herself. That was a common defense back then for all kinds of crimes committed against women, especially women like Nancy. It's believed that in a case of folie imposée, once that dominant force is out of the picture, the delusion fades on that other weaker person. Maybe if Sid had given things more time, maybe in time in prison, he would have made sense of what really happened. Or maybe he would have turned on Nancy. But he never got the chance. Sid Vicious died from a drug overdose in February of 1979, at the age of 21. His death was ruled an accidental overdose, but Deborah knew the truth. Sid wanted to die. She had the letters. Deborah kept the letters to herself. She never showed them to police or to anyone else. And she decided to publish them in her memoir. And notably, she titled the book, "And I Don't Want to Live This Life," from that line in Sid's poem about Nancy. For Deborah, it wasn't a tribute to Sid. It was more like a shared understanding of having someone you love die and not wanting to live anymore. One day, 18 months after Nancy's death, Deborah was at home watching the Phil Donahue show on TV. It was an episode that featured other parents. Parents of children who'd died violent deaths, who'd been murdered. These parents had even formed a support group. There wasn't one in Deborah's area, so she started her own chapter of the Parents of Murdered Children group. She found other parents, other mothers who experienced the anger, the isolation, the judgment, and most striking, the profound lack of regard for the parents of murder victims. Deborah would go on to become one of the strongest advocates for victims' rights in the country, showing up for families of victims at criminal trials and promoting a new framework for professionals, from cops to coroners, on how to talk about the deceased with their loved ones as more than just the body. This October 12th will mark 46 years since Nancy's death. Deborah Spungen is still here with us, in her 80s, still working to ensure that girls like Nancy, girls who don't light up rooms, don't vanish in the dark. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep. A special shout out to Robots in the Sun for the acoustic versions of the Sex Pistols. Until next time, night-night.